8-year-old Ellie Carter never expected her world to shatter in an instant, but the night her father was arrested for a crime he didn't commit, everything changed. The courtroom was against him, the evidence seemed undeniable, and no one believed the truth. But when Ellie overheard a secret conversation, one that revealed a hidden letter, a second accomplice, and a conspiracy designed to keep her father behind bars, she knew she had to act. With nothing but her courage and her voice, she took the stand, shocking the judge and exposing a dark secret that no one saw coming. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe, because tomorrow we've got a special surprise just for you. Ellie Carter sat cross-legged on the floor of her father's workshop, her tiny hands covered in grease as she carefully turned the wrench. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, but she didn't mind. It reminded her of him, her father. David Carter stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her with an amused grin. "You've got to tighten it just a little more, kiddo," he said, kneeling beside her. "But not too much, or you'll strip the bolt." Ellie squinted in concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly as she adjusted her grip. With a firm twist, the bolt locked into place. She looked up at her father, beaming. "Like that?" David chuckled and ruffled her hair. "Perfect. You're a natural, Elle." Rachel Carter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, shaking her head with a smile. "David, you do realize she's 8, not 18, right? She's going to end up knowing more about cars than half the guys in town." "That's the plan," David said proudly, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's got a sharp mind, reminds me of someone." He winked at his wife. Ellie grinned, feeling warm and proud. She loved moments like this. Just her, Mom and Dad, safe in their little world. Life was simple, happy. Her father had always taught her that honesty and hard work mattered more than anything, that the truth would always find a way to the surface, no matter how deep someone tried to bury it. "Dad?" she asked suddenly, tilting her head. "What if someone lies and nobody knows the truth?" David leaned against the workbench, considering her question. "Well, sometimes it takes a while, but lies don't last forever. The truth always finds its way out one way or another." Ellie nodded, satisfied with his answer. That night, the Carter family gathered around the dinner table. The scent of Rachel's homemade lasagna filled the small but cozy house. Laughter echoed through the dining room as Ellie recounted how she had successfully tightened a bolt on a customer's car that afternoon. "Next thing you know, she'll be running the shop," David joked, taking a bite of his food. Rachel rolled her eyes playfully. "Let's at least get her through elementary school first." Ellie giggled, but the warm moment was shattered by a sudden heavy knock on the front door. David's brow furrowed. Who could that be? Rachel glanced at the clock. It was almost 8, too late for visitors. Ellie felt a strange sense of unease creep up her spine. When David opened the door, the world seemed to tilt. Several uniformed officers stood on their porch, their faces unreadable. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "David Carter." David straightened. "That's me. You're under arrest for armed robbery and the murder of Michael Lawson." Rachel gasped. Ellie's fork clattered onto her plate. The next few seconds moved in slow motion. The officers grabbed David's arms, twisting them behind his back. He didn't resist. He just looked over his shoulder at Rachel, his face a mask of confusion. "This is a mistake," he protested. "I didn't do anything." Ellie's small hands clenched into fists. "Dad!" Rachel surged forward. "Wait! There! Has to be a misunderstanding. He was home. He was with us." But the officers weren't listening. The handcuffs clicked into place, and David was being dragged toward the waiting patrol car. Tears burned in Ellie's eyes as she scrambled to follow. "Where are you taking him? He didn't do anything." David twisted his head around, eyes locking onto Ellie's. "It's okay, Elle. Stay with Mom. Everything's going to be fine." But even at 8 years old, Ellie knew he was lying. Nothing would ever be fine again. The house felt eerily silent in the days following David's arrest. Ellie sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, her legs tucked under her, as though curling into herself might somehow make her invisible. Rachel paced the living room, phone in hand, her voice tight with desperation as she called. lawyer after lawyer, searching for someone to help. Each call ended the same way, with a sigh, a frown, and the unmistakable weight of rejection. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter," one attorney had said over the phone. "The evidence against your husband is overwhelming." It's not on the table after the call ended, her frustration boiling over. "Overwhelming," she muttered under her breath. "David wouldn't hurt anyone. How can they even believe this?" Ellie looked up at her mother. "Mum, they're wrong, aren't they? Dad didn't do it." Rachel's face softened, and she knelt beside Ellie, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Of course they're wrong, sweetheart. Your dad is innocent, but sometimes proving the truth isn't as easy as it should be." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of her father being dragged out of their house in handcuffs, the fear in his eyes, the panic in his voice. She hugged her stuffed bear tighter, trying to chase away the bad thoughts. But the harder she tried, the more restless she became. The next day, Rachel decided to take Ellie to her grandmother's house while she continued her search for a lawyer. "Just for a few days," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Grandma will take good care of you while I figure this out." Ellie didn't argue. She knew her mother was trying to shield her from the worst of it, but the weight of her father's absence was a constant ache in her chest. At her grandmother's house, the days felt slow and heavy, each hour stretching into the next. Ellie spent most of her time curled up in the corner of the guest room, doodling in her notebook. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard voices. They were faint, muffled, and coming from outside. Curiosity piqued. Ellie slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. Two men stood just outside the diner across the street, their voices low but urgent. "You sure about this?" one of them asked. "What if someone finds the letter?" "Relax," the other replied, his tone clipped. "No one's going to find it, and even if they do, it won't lead back to us. The other guy's already in the clear." Ellie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. A letter? Another guy. She pressed herself closer to the window, trying to catch every word, but the men moved further away, their voices fading into the night. She stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. What if this had something to do with her father? And if it did, how could she make anyone believe her? Ellie sat at the breakfast table, her mind replaying the conversation she had overheard the night before. Her grandmother bustled around the kitchen, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. But Ellie barely touched her plate. The words, "What if someone finds the letter?" and "the other guy's already in the clear," looped endlessly in her head. She clenched her fork, her knuckles turning white. "You're awfully quiet this morning," her grandmother said, glancing at her over the stove. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Ellie nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, what she had heard, but she didn't know how to begin. Would they believe her? Or would they brush it off, just like when she told her mum last week about seeing a suspicious car near their house? Later that afternoon, Rachel came to visit. Her face was drawn, and dark circles framed her eyes. Ellie felt a pang of guilt. Her mom was trying so hard to fix everything, but nothing seemed to be getting better. "Mom," Ellie said hesitantly, tugging on her sleeve as Rachel sat down at the kitchen table. "I heard something last night outside. Two men were talking." Rachel frowned, immediately concerned. "What do you mean? Were they near the house?" "No, they were by the diner," Ellie explained. "They said something about a letter. And someone else being in the clear." Rachel froze, her gaze sharpening. "What kind of letter?" Ellie hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, but they sounded like they didn't want anyone to find it. And they said something about another guy, like he did something bad, but no one suspects him." For a moment, Rachel didn't say anything. She seemed to be weighing Ellie's words, trying to decide if this was just a child's imagination or something more. Finally, she sighed and reached for Ellie's hand. "Sweetheart, I know you want to help your dad, but are you sure you didn't mishear them? People talk about all sorts of things, and it might not have anything to do with him." Ellie felt her chest tighten. "I'm not making it up. They were talking about hiding something, and I think it's important." Rachel's expression softened, but there was doubt in her eyes. Ellie, I believe you think it's important, but the police aren't going to take a story like that seriously unless there's real evidence. It's just complicated. Ellie pulled her hand away, frustration bubbling inside her. She wanted to scream, to make her mom understand, but instead she just muttered, "It's not complicated." Passed in a blur. Ellie retreated to the guest room, clutching her notebook as she scribbled down everything she could remember about the conversation. If no one else would believe her, she'd have to prove it herself. She wasn't sure how yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to give up. Her dad's freedom depended on it. The courtroom felt colder than Ellie expected. The polished wooden benches, the towering judge's bench, the stern-faced prosecutor, everything looked like it belonged in a movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and her father sat in the defendant's chair, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, his wrists no longer in handcuffs, but his freedom still out of reach. Rachel gripped Ellie's hand tightly as they sat in the gallery, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Her mother hadn't spoken much that morning, just going through the motions, dressing Ellie, combing her hair, and whispering that everything would be okay, even when Ellie knew she didn't believe it herself. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The trial was officially beginning. Ellie's heart pounded as the prosecutor, a man with slicked-back hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. He walked with the confidence of someone who already thought he had won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "The evidence will show that the defendant, David Carter, was not just present at the scene of the crime, but an active participant. We have eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and a clear motive." Ellie clenched her fists. Lies, all of it. The prosecutor continued, painting a picture of her father as a desperate man who got caught up in the wrong crowd. He spoke about a gun, about stolen money, about a security camera that caught a figure, matching David's description fleeing the scene. Then it was Mr. Hendrick's turn. He was her dad's lawyer, an older man with kind eyes but tired shoulders. He stood up and adjusted his glasses. "The prosecution would like you to believe this case is simple," he said. "That a good man, a father, a husband, suddenly turned to crime without any history or warning. But what they won't tell you is that David Carter has an alibi, that the so-called evidence is circumstantial, and that the real criminal may still be out there." Ellie held her breath, waiting for the jury to react. Some of them looked thoughtful, others unconvinced. The judge remained unreadable, his gavel resting beside him like a silent threat. Then the witnesses came, a man who claimed to have seen David running from the crime scene, a police officer who described how David was arrested. Each time, Mr. Hendricks tried to poke holes in their testimonies, but the prosecutor was relentless. By the end of the day, Ellie could see it in her father's face. He was losing hope. As they left the courtroom, Rachel kept a protective arm around Ellie, but Ellie wasn't thinking about comfort. She was thinking about what she had overheard, about the letter, about the other guy who got away clean. Nobody else seemed to know about that. If no one was going to find the truth, then she would have to do it herself. Ellie sat at the edge of her bed, flipping through her notebook, rereading the scribbled words over and over again. The missing letter. The second guy got away clean. No one suspects him. It had to mean something. It did mean something. But how could she prove it? Her father's trial was moving too fast. The prosecutor was making him look guilty. And if they didn't find something soon, the jury was going to believe it. Ellie couldn't let that happen. She needed proof. She tiptoed to her bedroom door and listened. Her mother was in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones on the phone. Probably another lawyer, another dead end. Taking a deep breath, Ellie slipped out of her room and made her way down the hall, careful to avoid the floorboards she knew creaked. Her father's workshop sat at the back of the house, dark and untouched since his arrest. The smell of motor oil and sawdust still lingered as Ellie pushed the door open, her heart pounding. She ran her hands over his workbench, searching for anything out of place. There were tools scattered around, old invoices, loose screws. Nothing that looked like a missing letter. Then she saw it, a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of manuals. Ellie grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she flipped open the lid. Inside was a neatly folded envelope, yellowed at the edges. On the front, in her father's careful handwriting, were the words, "For emergencies." She sucked in a breath and pulled out the letter. "David, if anything happens, if anyone asks, keep this safe. It's proof. You were with me that night. We both know who was really there. Don't let them bury the truth." Ellie's hands shook as she reread the letter. This was it. Proof that her dad had an alibi. But who was M? And why hadn't this door made her nearly drop the letter? "Mrs. Carter," a deep voice asked. "Can we have a word?" Ellie scrambled to put everything back, stuffing the letter into her pocket before running out of the workshop. From behind the hallway wall, she peeked into the living room. Two men stood at the door. One was a police officer, the other a man in a dark suit. "We received an anonymous tip that your husband may be hiding evidence," the officer said. "We need to search the premises." Rachel's face went pale. "That's ridiculous," she said, blocking the doorway. "You can't just barge in here without a warrant." Ellie clutched the letter in her pocket, her pulse racing. Someone was trying to cover their tracks. Someone didn't want this letter to be found. She wasn't just looking for the truth anymore. She was in the middle of something dangerous. And now she had to figure out how to use what she'd found, before it was too late. Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the letter so tightly her fingers ached. The words on the paper swam in her vision. Proof. You were with me that night. Her father had an alibi. Someone knew the truth, but no one was listening. Down the hall, she could hear her mother arguing with the officers. They hadn't come with a warrant, so they couldn't search the house. Not yet. But the way they spoke, the way they pressed her mother for information, sent a shiver through Ellie's spine. Someone wanted to make sure this letter never saw the light of day. She had to act fast. Sliding off the bed, she tiptoed to her closet, dug through her school backpack, and carefully folded the letter, tucking it deep inside. If they searched the house, they wouldn't find it. Not if she had anything to do with it. A knock at her door made her jump. "Ellie?" Rachel's voice was strained, tired. "Sweetheart, can I come in?" Ellie quickly zipped up her bag and pulled a blanket over her lap before answering. "Yeah, her." Mother stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her eyes looked distant, like she was carrying too many worries at once. She sat on the bed and ran a hand through Ellie's hair. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked softly. Ellie nodded, but she knew her mother could see through it. "Who were those men?" Rachel sighed. "The police say someone tipped them off, that your dad was hiding something, but they don't have any real evidence, so they can't do anything. Not yet." Ellie swallowed hard. "Mom, what if Dad was hiding something? Not because he did anything wrong, but because it proved he didn't." Rachel's expression flickered. "Ellie, why would you say that?" Ellie hesitated. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to show her the letter, make her understand. But after what happened last time, would her mother even believe her? Or would she just dismiss it again? She clenched her fists. "I just think maybe they're looking in the wrong place." Rachel studied her for a long moment, then sighed and kissed the top of her head. "I know you miss your dad, baby. I do too. But we have to trust the system." Ellie's stomach twisted. The system. The same system that had dragged her father away in handcuffs. The same system that was ignoring the truth. Trust wasn't going to save him. She had to. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Ellie pulled out the letter again and traced the signature at the bottom. M. Someone with an M knew her dad was innocent. She grabbed her notebook and started writing down every name she could think of. Mechanics at the shop, family, friends, people her dad had worked with. Someone out there had the answers, and Ellie was going to find them before the wrong people found her first. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open. In front of her, the list of names she had written the night before stared back at her, but none of them seemed right. She tapped her pencil against the paper, her mind racing. M. It could be anyone. One of her dad's co-workers, an old friend, even someone from their neighborhood. But if this person knew her father was innocent, why hadn't they come forward? The thought made her stomach twist. Maybe they were scared, or maybe, Ellie swallowed hard, maybe someone had stopped them. She was about to write down more possibilities when a sharp knock at the door made her jump. Rachel, who had been cleaning dishes at the sink, froze. The knock came again, louder this time. With a hesitant glance at Ellie, Rachel wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer it. Ellie's pulse quickened when she saw who it was. Reggie. He stood on the front porch, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. Ellie recognized him. He had been in the courtroom, whispering with the prosecutor, the same man whose voice she had heard outside the diner. Rachel stiffened. "What do you want?" Reggie smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just wanted to check in, see how you and the kid are holding up." His gaze flickered to eyes. "Tough situation." "We're fine." Reggie stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I know this has been hard on you, but the best thing you can do, for yourself and for your daughter, is to let this go." Rachel's fingers tightened. Around the door. "Excuse me," Reggie sighed, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "The case is open and shut. The evidence is stacked against David. The more you push, the worse it'll be for you. And the girl." He nodded toward Ellie. "You don't want her getting caught up in something she doesn't understand." Ellie's heart pounded. He knew. Somehow, he knew she was digging. Rachel's expression turned to steel. "Get off my porch," Reggie gave a slow smirk. "Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Rachel slammed the door in his face. For a long moment, the house was silent. Then Rachel exhaled sharply and turned to Ellie. "I don't want you talking to that man, ever. Do you understand?" Ellie nodded, but inside fear curled around her ribs. Reggie didn't just come here to scare Mom. He had come because he thought Ellie knew something, and that meant she was on the right track. She tightened her grip on her notebook. If they wanted her to stop, that meant she was getting close, and no matter how dangerous it was, she wasn't going to stop until her dad was free. Ellie sat on the cold wooden bench outside the courtroom, her hands clenched into fists. The air smelled of old paper and polished floors, the kind of place where decisions were made that couldn't be undone. The hallway was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps and the distant hum of voices from inside the courtroom. Her mother sat beside her, gripping Ellie's shoulder tightly, her knuckles white. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Rachel whispered, her voice thick with worry. "You don't have to." Ellie swallowed hard. She was terrified. The idea of walking into that courtroom, standing in front of strangers, the judge, the jury, the people who already believed her father was guilty, it made her stomach churn. But she had no choice. "I have to, Mom," she said firmly. "It's the only way they'll listen." Rachel sighed, pressing her lips into a thin line before nodding. A moment later, the heavy doors swung open, and Mr. Hendricks stepped out. "It's time," he said, his voice low but steady. Ellie took a deep breath and stood. Her legs felt wobbly as she followed him inside. The courtroom was full, lawyers, jurors, reporters scribbling in their notepads. The judge sat at his towering bench, looking down at her with an unreadable expression. And there, at the defense table, was her father, his tired eyes locked onto hers, full of something she had never seen before. Fear. She climbed into the witness chair, her heart hammering. The judge asked her to state her name. Her voice shook as she answered. Then the questions began. Mr. Hendricks took slow steps toward her, his voice gentle but firm. "Ellie, can you tell the court why you're here today?" Ellie licked her dry lips. "Because my dad didn't do it," she said, forcing the words out. "And I can prove it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. Mr. Hendricks nodded. "How do you know that?" Ellie sat up straighter. "Because I heard something. The night after my dad was arrested, I overheard two men talking outside a diner. They said something about a missing letter, and that the real guy, the other guy, got away clean." The room went silent. The prosecutor stood. "Objection. She's a child." She could have misheard, but Mr. Hendricks was ready. "Objection, Your Honor. Let's allow her to finish." The judge considered, then nodded. "Proceed." Ellie's fingers curled into her dress. "I found the letter," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It was in my dad's workshop. Someone named M wrote it. It says my dad wasn't there that night. He was with him." Gasps filled the room. For the first time, Ellie saw it, the shift in the jurors' faces. They were listening, and for the first time, she believed she might actually save her father. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the judge's gavel banging sharply against the wood to restore order. Ellie could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she didn't shrink back. She sat tall in the witness chair, her hands gripping the edges as if holding on for dear life. Mr. Hendricks stepped closer. "Ellie, this letter you found, do you still have it?" Ellie nodded and reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the folded paper. Carefully, she pulled it out and handed it to him. Mr. Hendricks unfolded the letter and held it up for the courtroom to see. This letter, written by someone identified only as M, states that David Carter was not at the scene of the crime, that he was somewhere else entirely. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is crucial evidence." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection! This letter could have been fabricated by the defense." Glasses, eyeing the paper. "Mr. Hendricks, does the defense have any way to verify the authenticity of this letter?" Mr. Hendricks smiled faintly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Actually, Your Honor, we do." He turned toward the gallery. "We located the person who wrote it." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man stepped inside. The room fell into stunned silence as he walked forward, his hands trembling at his sides. Ellie gasped. She recognized him. M. It was Marcus Hill, one of her dad's old co-workers at the garage. The prosecutor's face twisted in frustration. "This is highly irregular." The judge lifted a hand. "We will hear what he has to say. Bailiff, escort Mr. Hill to the stand." Marcus took his seat, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. His eyes flickered to David before settling on the judge. Mr. Hendricks wasted no time. "Mr. Hill, do you recognize this letter?" Marcus swallowed hard. "Yeah, I wrote it. A collective." Gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor was already shaking his head. "And why did you never come forward before?" Marcus hesitated, looking down. "Because I was scared." He took a deep breath, then turned to David. "I was with him that night. We were working late at the shop when we heard about the robbery. On the news. He couldn't have done it. He was with me the whole time." Ellie clutched her mother's hand, her chest tightening with hope. Mr. Hendricks took a step forward. "And yet, you let an innocent man sit in jail while you stayed silent?" Marcus lowered his head. "I got threatened." His voice cracked. "By Reggie." The room exploded. Ellie's breath caught. She turned toward Reggie, who sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his jaw clenched. The judge banged the gavel again. "Order!" But Ellie knew. The truth was finally unraveling. The courtroom was in chaos. The judge's gavel pounded against the wood, but the murmurs of shock and disbelief refused to die down. Ellie gripped the edge of her seat, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Marcus Hill had just dropped a bombshell. Her father had been framed, and Reggie was behind it. Reggie shifted in his seat at the prosecution's table, his face darkening, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw twitching. Ellie knew that look. She had seen it the night he came to their house, warning her mother to back off. But now everyone in the room was staring at him. The weight of suspicion had shifted. Mr. Hendricks pressed forward, his voice sharp. "Mr. Hill, when you say you were threatened by Reggie, what exactly do you mean?" Marcus hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "He came to me the day after David was arrested, told me if I said anything, I'd end up in a worse place than him." His fingers dug into his jeans. "I believed him." The judge turned to Reggie, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Owens, do you have anything to say about this accusation?" Reggie forced a smirk, leaning back in his chair. "This is ridiculous. A desperate attempt by the defense to shift blame." He shot a glare at Marcus. "You're telling me you sat on this for weeks and just now decided to speak up?" Marcus straightened, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "Because I knew you'd try to silence me again. But I can't let an innocent man take the fall anymore." The prosecutor looked rattled. He shuffled through his papers, searching for a way to salvage his case. "Even if this is true, we still have security footage of someone resembling Mr. Carter fleeing the scene." Mr. Hendricks smirked. "Funny you should mention that." He turned to the back of the courtroom and gestured toward a man holding a laptop. Your Honor, the defense has obtained additional footage that the prosecution somehow overlooked. The judge nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed slightly as the video played on the courtroom screen. It was grainy, black and white, taken from a different angle outside the convenience store where the crime happened. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, the figure running out the back door. It wasn't her dad. He was taller, broader, moving in a way that didn't match David Carter at all. And then the man turned his head slightly. Gasps filled the room. Reggie's face was unmistakable. The color drained from Reggie's face. He lurched forward. This isn't... The prosecutor stood, his mouth slightly open as if realizing too late that his case had just fallen apart. The judge sighed heavily, then turned to the bailiff. Mr. Owens, please stand. Ellie squeezed her mother's hand. As Reggie was placed in handcuffs for the first time in weeks, she could table, his hands trembling as the judge turned his gaze toward him. The courtroom was still reeling from the shocking revelation, but all Ellie could focus on was her father. He looked exhausted, like the weight of the world had been pressing down on him for too long. But for the first time since his arrest, there was something new in his expression. Hope. The judge cleared his throat, his voice firm. Given the new evidence presented today, the court has no choice but to re-evaluate the charges against the defendant. Effective immediately, David Carter is fully exonerated of all charges. Rachel let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. Ellie's heart soared. It was over. Her father was free. David turned to Mr. Hendricks, shaking his hand, but his eyes were already searching for Ellie and Rachel. When he found them, he smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. Ellie leapt from her seat and ran straight into his arms, her small frame colliding against him as he lifted her up. "You did it, Elle," he whispered against her hair. "You saved me." Tears burned in Ellie's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I told you, Dad. The truth always comes out." Rachel wrapped her arms around them both, her body shaking as she buried her face against David's shoulder. The family held onto each other tightly, unwilling to let go as reporters swarmed the courtroom. Cameras flashed, voices called out questions, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was that they were together again. As they stepped outside, the sunlight was almost blinding. The air felt lighter, freer. A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. Some were strangers, others were neighbors who had once whispered behind their backs. But now they were clapping, supporting them. A journalist shoved a microphone forward. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to finally be free?" David tightened his grip on Ellie's hand. "I feel grateful for my family, for the truth. Coming to light, and most of all," he looked down at Ellie, pride shining in his eyes, "for my daughter, who refused to stop fighting." Ellie felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't look away. She had done this. She had made them listen. As they made their way home, Rachel turned to David, her voice thick with emotion. "No one should have to go through what we did. We were lucky to have found the truth. But what about the people who don't?" David nodded slowly, thoughtful. "Maybe we can do something about that." Ellie perked up. "Like what?" Her father smiled at her. "Like making sure no other family has to fight alone." And that was the moment the Carter Foundation was born, a promise to fight for the innocent, just as Ellie had fought for him. A promise that no voice, no matter how small, would ever be ignored again. The framed letter hung on the wall of David Carter's workshop, its edges slightly worn, but its message clear. Ellie stood in front of it, tracing the words with her eyes. Don't let them bury the truth. She had read it so many times. She had memorized every curve of the letters, every crease in the paper. This letter had saved her father's life. David stepped beside her, crossing his arms as he looked at the frame. "Never thought I'd see that up there," he admitted. Ellie turned to him. "It's important." He nodded. "Yeah, it is." The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Her father was free, Reggie was behind bars, and the town had started looking at the Carter family differently, not with suspicion, but with admiration. Her name had been in newspapers, interviews, even a TV special, but none of that mattered as much as what they were doing next. Rachel walked into the workshop, a stack of papers in her hands. "We're officially registered," she said with a smile. David took the papers, flipping through them. "The Carter Foundation," he read aloud. "Still can't believe we're doing this." Ellie grinned. "We have to. There are other families out there like us, people who don't have anyone to fight for them. What if they don't have a missing letter or a Marcus Hill to come forward?" David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then we fight for them," Rachel nodded. "We find the people who need help. We give them a voice." It was an idea that had started as a quiet conversation on the car ride home from the courthouse, but it had grown into something real. They had already received emails from people who had heard their story, people desperate for someone to believe them, and Ellie, despite being only 8 years old, was ready. The next morning, she sat in the small office they had set up in the house, watching as her father answered phone calls, as her mother typed away on the computer, as they started making a difference. She felt something deep in her chest, something warm, something steady. She had saved her father. Now, at night she lay in bed, she would, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. The arrest, the trial, the way no one had listened to her at first. She had almost given up, almost believed she was too small to change anything. But she wasn't. She had proven that the truth, no matter how buried, could always come out. Her father's words echoed in her head. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Ellie closed her eyes, letting those words settle inside her, because she knew now, no matter how dark things got, no matter how much people tried to silence the truth, she would always make them listen.